Stranger Things premiered on Netflix in 2016. The series followed a group of friends who uncovered the supernatural and a government plot to weaponize the unexplainable. The show's original title was Montauk, an homage to the conspiracy of Stranger Things. This story was only a series of rumors before 1992, when Preston Nichols published his book, The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. It unveiled an operation similar to MKUltra, where subjects interacted with substances and technologies purported to influence thought, manipulate time, and pierce dimensions. It was a story about government experimentation that included psychic development, extra-dimensional beings, and thought control. But unlike Stranger Things, many believed this story to be true. The history of the Montauk Project begins with an earlier conspiracy, the Philadelphia experiment. In 1955, an amateur author and ufologist, Morris Jessup, published a book called The Case for the UFO. Shortly after, he began to receive letters of criticism from Carl Allen under the pseudonym Carlos Allende. These letters attacked Jessup's book for a lack of knowledge about the physics involved, especially Einstein's unproven unified field theory. The unified field theory describes an attempt to unify fundamental forces of physics beneath a single theoretical framework. For example, the theory would explain how electromagnetism and gravity are aspects of the same force. In his letter, Allen explained that he had studied, understood, and witnessed proof of the unified field theory. He went on to describe the 1943 Philadelphia experiment. Carl Allen claimed to have been stationed on the SS Andrew Furoseth. In the summer of 1943, he claimed to have witnessed a destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, push out from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard with only a skeleton crew and orders to test a top-secret technology. Outside the harbor, the generators were engaged and an electromagnetic field was created around the ship. Strangely, a green fog engulfed the vessel before it briefly disappeared. When it returned to the harbor, it brought with it a nightmarish and gruesome scene. Some crewmates had been vaporized. Others had been fused to the bulkhead of the ship. Surviving members complained of debilitating headaches and nausea. Most had succumbed to madness. However, not all of the missing crewmen had expired. One would re-emerge decades later with an even stranger story. His name was Al Bielek. In 1988, Al Bielek claimed to have uncovered hidden memories that had been sublimated through government experimentation. Bielek claimed that his actual name was Edward Cameron, and he had been born in 1916. He and his brother, Duncan Cameron, were naval soldiers on the deck of the USS Eldridge. When the fog emerged, the two men jumped overboard. However, they didn't land in the Atlantic. At the 1990 MUFON conference, Bielek explained how they slipped through time at random until finally landing in 1983. The men appeared on site at Camp Hero, a military base located at the tip of Montauk, New York. The military base at Camp Hero was commissioned in 1942 as a coastal defense station. A battery of weapons were installed to defend New York against German naval vessels during World War II. The US military disguised the base as a coastal fishing village. The military buildings were fitted with fake exterior wood paneling, and windows were painted into place. In 1951, Camp Hero became an Air Force base with a semi-automatic ground environment installation. This radar dish collated information from smaller radar dishes that ran along the eastern coast. This information provided the US with a 30-minute warning for an incoming Soviet nuclear missile attack. Preston Nichols claimed to have worked on site at Camp Hero, and the following events are outlined in his book. While the Philadelphia experiment had been discontinued, much of the team and resources were relocated for further study under the operational name Phoenix 2, colloquially known as the Montauk Project. The operation was officially relocated to Camp Hero due to the retired SAGE radar dish that could broadcast between 425 and 450 megahertz. Similar to the Gateway tapes, the researchers wanted to explore sound frequencies and how they could manipulate human consciousness. Researchers at Camp Hero began to utilize the retired radar dish by transmitting frequencies to a single chair inside of a safe, concrete satellite building. Bielek's brother Duncan Cameron was selected as the main subject for many of these experiments. He was exposed to pulse and wave frequencies, amplified by gigawatts of energy. Researchers noticed a correlation between the transmitted frequencies and affected moods. Cameron would laugh or cry, become agitated or fatigued. In fact, the entire base would fall under the influence of these frequencies, mimicking the same emotions. These experiments eventually took a toll on Duncan. Scarification of the lungs and brain tissue led to grievous injuries, but somehow he continued to walk the grounds and participate in their experiments. The researchers attenuated the signal from the radar and expanded their subject base to unwitting Army staff and civilians in the surrounding area. The mapping of frequencies and their outcomes was only part of the experiment. They wanted to progress to broadcasting new, alternate realities. In the mid-1970s, the experiments included the Montauk chair. Using Helmholtz coils, a stable and unified magnetic field surrounded the chair and the subject. The first experiment they conducted was called the Seeing Eye. Subjects would be seated in the Montauk chair and given an item of significance, like a lock of hair or personal effect from a target. After concentration and training, they would be able to see through the eyes of their targets. This experiment is similar to the Stargate project, a US Army unit from the late 70s confirmed by declassified documentation. The subjects were conducting remote viewings. It wasn't long until they could directly influence the world around them. They could control inanimate objects and electronics, changing stations on radios and televisions, turning off devices, or even destroying them. Later, the subjects began to take control of civilians, causing them to commit crimes or behave erratically. As the experiments continued, researchers noticed that their results sometimes occurred on a longer time frame. For example, Duncan may influence events or manifest objects outside of the current time. This led to experimentation with time itself. Duncan Cameron created an aperture at 20-year intervals, a portal that would allow them to travel to the past and the future. Researchers began to send soldiers and scientists to explore what was called hyperspace. It was during these experiments that Duncan began to report sensing a higher intelligence. Crew members fixed radio and video transmitters to exploratory crews, which fed a live feed back to the base in Montauk. They abducted vagrants from New York City to send through the portals, testing the effects of travel on the human body. Nichols claimed that there was a large on-site library of videotapes for every mission, tapes he himself had watched. They began to abduct boys between the ages of 10 and 16 and send them through the portal. Their first training mission was always the same. They would travel to the year 6037 to a world that was in ruins and described as stationary and without life. They ran the transmitter non-stop to conduct these experiments, and the device escaped their control. It had fallen into synchronization with someone or something else. And some speculated this was the higher intelligence Cameron had sensed. This created some sort of rift or aberration. It was then that a being was manifested on site. Some claim it was a subconscious manifestation. Others claim it was the higher intelligence. Anyone who saw the beast saw something different. The creature attacked, destroying equipment and buildings on site. Meanwhile, the transmitter could not be powered off or interrupted. Researchers attempted to disengage the power and disconnect the data cabling, but it wasn't until an acetylene torch was used to cut through the equipment that the aperture through time was finally closed. In conclusion, Nichols claims a team of Black Berets eliminated the majority of witnesses, and construction teams poured concrete through the halls of the underground base. The Montauk project was discontinued. The Montauk Project sold over 100,000 copies and became a cult classic in the early 1990s. Following its success, Nichols authored 5 additional volumes. Many heard the story of the Montauk Project, and they began to project themselves into the narrative. They swore they were Montauk boys that had been awakened, their sublimated memories resurfacing, just as Al Bielek had described. Stuart Swerdlow was a notable example. Swerdlow claimed that the Montauk Project targeted boys they believed to be expendable, those who were orphans or runaways. He claims they would fracture the minds of these boys by freezing, starving, and beating them. They would be tortured while under the influence of psychedelics, with the purpose of expanding their abilities and making them pliable for future experiments. Swerdlow would publish a book, Montauk, The Alien Connection, and it detailed some of his early life and involvement in the project. Some skeptics have pointed to Swerdlow's spotty history as a sign that he's potentially a grifter. Swerdlow pled guilty to embezzlement charges for taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from a local food distributor. After serving his time, he plugged into the Montauk narrative and eventually transitioned to becoming a New Age advisor, providing psychic guidance for steep consulting fees. While some suspected Swerdlow of financial exploitation, others had even deeper suspicions. In 1998, Chris Ketchum wrote an article for Gear magazine, reporting that over 25 boys claimed to have participated in the Montauk Project. They made the pilgrimage to visit Preston Nichols, some traveling across the country. These boys often came from broken homes. One example is Anthony Kraft, who had been in the foster system, suffering years of abuse before aging out. He was an addict and frequently spoke of delusions, and he was one that got swept into the conspiracy of the Montauk Project, traveling to Preston Nichols' home for a session of deprogramming. The deprogramming technique was called hand scanning. In an interview with another former Montauk boy, Brandon Kill, Ketchum uncovered that Nichols would take these boys to a bedroom alone, require them to undress, then massage their bodies while he claimed to be scanning for frequencies. Then, he would begin to touch the subjects inappropriately. These subjects were over the age of 18, and they firmly believed they had been participants in one of the most elaborate government experiments ever conducted. When confronted about the deprogramming process, Nichols and his subjects told Ketchum they had received no pleasure in these sessions. They were simply a grim necessity. Nichols claimed to have stopped these deprogramming sessions in late 1998. Since Camp Hero has closed, the government has tried to sell the land for real estate development. However, environmentalists protested at the slightest rumor of an exchange. As a result, the site was turned into a state park in 2002. The derelict buildings and remaining underground tunnels are off limits to the public, but urban explorers have trespassed into these areas with the hopes of uncovering some proof of the Montauk project. One explorer, Brian Minnick, discovered a tunnel underground that had an oversized, heavy door with a spindle lock, like a bank vault door. Minnick uncovered rooms decorated with psychedelic wallpaper, and many have posited that these rooms were used for some of the experiments. Most notably, Minnick claimed to have discovered records that indicated vast quantities of food purchased for Camp Hero in the late 1980s, totaling to over $80,000 per month, even though the base had been officially decommissioned well before. In July 2008, a strange and discolored creature washed ashore near Camp Hero. 3 girls walking along the beach at Ditch Plains stopped to inspect what they thought was the body of a sun-baked dog. It had cloth-like bindings around its legs, and it had what looked to be a beak instead of a snout. An image taken by the girls was first published in The Independent before it was picked up by Gawker and circulated nationally. Loren Coleman, the director of the International Cryptozoology Museum, traveled to New York, but by the time he arrived, the body of the creature was gone. At first, people speculated the creature came from the Animal Disease Center on nearby Plum Island. Perhaps the creature had escaped from the laboratory and died in the water. However, later visitors to the Animal Disease Center confirmed that security measures were extensive and an animal escape was unlikely. Others began to speculate that the creature was the result of experiments conducted at Montauk, that somehow the aperture had never closed. An unidentified source told reporter Drew Grant that he and some friends had discovered a dead raccoon and given it a Viking's funeral, setting it alight and pushing it to sea. Loren Coleman would later confirm that this theory was the most plausible. He explained that decomposition combined with impacts of rough water can cause what is known as slippage, when skin and underlying fat separate from one another to cause the distorted appearance of the Montauk monster. However, in 2020, there appeared another creature on the beach of Montauk. It was almost identical to the first, and it appeared shortly before 4th of July, the exact same time of year as the creature from 2008. For some, this bizarre coincidence points to a more supernatural explanation. The Montauk Project is another entry in a long catalog of conspiracies, an attempt to not only explore but weaponize the human mind, to stumble into the strange gap between known and unknown. This is the story that gave root to Stranger Things, and yet certainly there are stranger things to come.